morning. It's good to be back again, and we want to pick up where we left off last night. We discussed surviving the terrible twos, where we addressed verses 5 through 7 of the book of Jude. Today we're going to look at poking the bear, and we'll look at verses 3 to 4, but the center of our focus will be on verses 8 through 16. Once again, I provided a translation for Jude for you in your notes, and you're more than welcome to look at that and use that as we work our way through the book of Jude. Now, I titled this sermon is Poking the Bear, and when we stop and think about bears and poking them, to poke a bear is an act in such a way that has a good chance of causing trouble. And you don't want to poke a sleeping bear because he's liable to wake up in anger. You don't want to poke a mama cub's bear because mama bear's maternal instincts are liable to be awakened. And when you think about poking bears, you can poke a bear once and maybe get away with it, but if you keep poking, the bear is going to get really angry. Today I want to look at bear pokers in Jude. Judean bear pokers. And when we think about Judean bear pokers, I'm thinking about the Jewish religious leaders that are throughout all of Judea that were poking the bear, namely the Roman Empire. They want to revolt against Rome. They're poking the bear. And ultimately, they're poking God. And they're poking God by ungodly behaviors, godless activities, as Jude deemed them, or criminal behavior as Rome had declared them to be. So this morning we want to look at a period, or just understand that throughout all of Judea, from Judea to Jerusalem to Samaria to Galilee, all along these coastal plains, we have a political and religious unrest happening in Judea. This is Jude's culture. This is Jude's historical setting. And Jude is living in a very hostile country, striving to make war with Rome and ultimately practicing godless activities. And it's a threat to the Judean church, the Judean Christians. Religious leaders were rebelling against Rome, and they were vying for control of Judea. It was a dangerous period of time for a Judean Christian, a Judean follower of Jesus, to be living. Because to say, I will not join the revolt because I follow King Jesus, could cost them their lives. So the first thing I want to focus on is when we look at Jude, we need to begin in verses 3 and 4 so we can see at least a summary of Jude's concerns concerning the godless people that this church of Judea is surrounded by. And so when we look at verse 3, we see that Jude writes, "Beloved, although I was making every effort to write to you about our common deliverance," or salvation as some translations might say, "I now feel it necessary to write to you with this intention, with this purpose, in order to encourage you to defend the faith that was passed down to the saints once for all." He is writing this letter during a time when his brother has just been martyred, James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem. He has been martyred. And now there's a leadership gap. But one of the good things about the early church in Judea was that James had 7 elders, and Jude was one of these elders. Okay, but just imagine, a major player, a major leader in your congregations throughout Judea has just been murdered. There's not only a leadership vacuum, there's fear. Are we going to make it through this? And Jude wants to write about their common deliverance, their common salvation that they've experienced from the very beginning. And you go back and look in the book of Acts, and you can see how God preserved this early church as it was growing throughout Judea. He wanted to go in that direction But something was going on in the country which caused him to have to shift directions. And so, even though he wanted to write about this common deliverance, to encourage them to hang in there with Jesus, he finds it now necessary to change directions in order to defend the faith. Now that's tomorrow. Oh no, that's the second message for today. That's not tomorrow, is it? It's today, after this one. But I do want to pause and look at the reason. He gives us reasons why he's changing. The reason is some people have slipped in among you who were written about long ago for this condemnation. They are godless people who continually change the grace of our God into immoral behavior. And who continually deny our only Master and Lord, Jesus. And the thing I want to focus on here is that there are several things that are being mentioned here that are important. Let me go back and talk about the fact that he's recognizing people have slipped into their churches that are what? Godless people. That's number one. He knows godless people are in their midst. They've slipped in. They're part of this movement of rebellion against Rome. They've slipped in, and they're spying them out. Are you for us? Are you against us? The other thing is, he makes it fairly clear they're godless. They do not know God. They may be sitting in your congregations, but let me give you what. Newsflash: they're not followers of Jesus, which takes us to the second. Some other concerns that he has is that they were written for condemnation. He's telling them these godless people that are roaming throughout the country, who's causing this rebellion against Rome, they're condemned. Another thing about these people is they've changed the grace of our God into immoral behavior. Remember I talked about the word immoral in verse 7 yesterday, and how it had a limited sense to immoral behavior as it concerns marital norms, God's desire for marriage between a husband and a wife. Now he's using the term immoral here in a much broader sense. This word for immorality here is much broader. It includes stealing, lying. It concerns immoral behavior concerning the marriage. And it concerns many things. It's a very broad use for immorality. And he's going to focus on the type of immorality that's going on in Judea later on. We'll get to that in a minute. And then finally, they've denied Jesus. These folks, these Jewish religious leaders, have denied Jesus as being Messiah. And so godless people, people who are condemned, people who rebel against God, people who deny Jesus as Messiah, were in their congregations. And he's concerned. Jude is writing to a group of Jewish Christians living in a godless society. How do you preserve godliness when you're living in a godless society? Now let's look at the charges that Jude has against these godless people. And we're going to look at verses 8 through 10, and verse 11. Yet in the same way also, these people, godless people, who are dreamers, defile the flesh, rebel against authority, and slander the glorious ones. Now I need to pick up and talk about this yet in the same way. He's just got done talking verses 5 through 7. And remember last night we talked about 5 through 7. How Jude wanted them to remember the past. I want you to remember something. God is not a respecter of persons when it comes to rebellion. You rebel against God, if you're God's chosen, and you rebel against His leading, you're going to be punished. If you're an angel and you decide you no longer want to be in the heavens any longer, you have to rebel. You're going to be judged. And remember about Gentiles. If you decide to reject God's marital norms, you're going to be judged. God doesn't like rebellion. He doesn't care who you are. You're out. Right? And we all have
propensity to rebel. Jude knows that. He's writing to a group of Judean Christians who have this propensity to rebel. And they're being tempted to what? Rebel. Against who? Rome! And now he's going to start talking about these godless people that are roaming throughout Judea, trying to entice people to join this rebellion against Rome. And here's what he describes them. They defile the flesh. Now what does that mean? Well, the idea of defiling flesh has to do with religious contamination. They are religiously contaminated people. You think, Jews, they worship God. He's saying, no, you maybe realize something. They're contaminated. Their worship isn't meaning anything to God. Generally, religious contamination within Judea concerned having contact with dead. They're things that were unclean. Touching a pig or working with leather, dead carcasses. That would make you unclean for worship. You could also be considered unclean for improper worship, for worshiping idols, for unbelief. This contaminates. And of course, the religious leaders have already denied Jesus as Messiah, so their worship is already contaminated. And then there's this contamination because of moral misconduct. And that's what he's going to zero in on. These godless people throughout Judea are religiously contaminated because of the way they live. And he's going to zero in on that in a few verses. Finally, another one is they rebel against authority. Now this isn't just Roman authority, they're rebelling against God. They have rejected Jesus as Messiah. They rejected the fact that Jesus has ushered in the kingdom of God. And then finally, he talks about how they are slanderers, or some of your texts will say they blaspheme the glorious ones. The idea of blasphemy has the idea of speaking poorly of someone in a negative manner. And so they're speaking negatively of angels. And there's a number of ways in which this could be done. It could be that they're claiming these angels are good angels and these angels are bad angels, and they're entering into discussions about heavenly things that they actually have absolutely no knowledge of. But they're speaking out of ignorance about items and things that they're totally ignorant of. And the other reason why I think this has to do, the glorious ones has to do with angels, is because of the next verse. Look what we see next. And this is an example from Jewish tradition. But Michael the archangel, when he argued with the devil, he disputed about Moses' body. But he dared not bring a slanderous judgment against the devil. But rather he said, "May the Lord rebuke you." So here Jude stops for a moment and he appeals to a story from Jewish tradition that floated around throughout all of Judea. And it's a tradition about how when Moses died, the devil and Michael fights over the body of Moses. And supposedly because Moses killed an Egyptian. He shouldn't be in heaven. And Michael says, he should be in heaven. He was God's chosen. And so you've got this dispute going on between the devil trying to prosecute and declare how it is that Moses should not be in heaven. And Michael coming along and saying, oh yeah, he should, and he's a defense attorney, and they're going at it. And it's a legal type of courtroom. And they're battling back and forth like Perry Mason. But Michael understands something. He's not the judge. God's the judge. And he's not going to issue a judgment because that's God's responsibility. And so he refrains from making judgments. And this is one of the problems that Jude condemns the godless about. they're making judgments about things that's none of their business. So we read next, in contrast to Michael, who reserves and refrains from making judgments about these things, says the godless people can continually slander whatever they don't understand. It's not just the glorious ones, not just about angels, about everything. They got a problem. And they are corrupting themselves. How are they corrupting themselves? By slandering whatever they don't even understand. They act like irrational animals. There's no reasoning, there's no rationale. It's all emotive. Getting caught up in the emotion of the revolt. Let's revolt. We need to revolt. And hearing all the rhetoric and listening to all the slander about how bad Rome is and what it is we need to do to usher in God's kingdom. We need to revolt. Let's get going. Let's get that emotion going. Are we all emotional about it? And so people are jumping into this revolt without even thinking. And even though some people who are rational trying to convince them otherwise, they're not thinking. So godless people, what Jude's telling us, one of the charges that he has, or three of the charges that he has, is that they're religiously contaminated. Their worship really doesn't mean anything to God because it's contaminated. Within this godless society, we've got a lot of insubordination. Insubordinate to the Roman Empire, in which God has placed this nation, and against God, and His Messiah, and His kingdom. And then finally, slanderers who are corrupting themselves. They're slandering this person, that person, angels, political feeling. They're slandering everybody and anybody without, sometimes just out of emotion, and showing their own ignorance and corrupting themselves. Well, that's the first set of charges. I'm already worn out, but there's a second set. There's a second set of charges, and it's found in verse 16 of Jude. He says, godless people are grumblers. They are fault finders who go after their own desires. They speak pompous things, or one translation, bombastic things, by admiring faces for personal gain. Now, this charge about being grumblers, when you think about a grumbler in the Bible, this is class participation. Grumblers in the Bible, what comes to your mind? Israel, where at? In the wilderness, that's exactly right. If you want to talk about grumbling, everybody refers to that Israelite in Ezekiel, in Isaiah, in Hebrews, and Corinthians. When you want to talk about grumbling and complaining, everybody points to the Exodus generation. Excessive grumbling. I'm tired of manna. Is this all we're going to get today? Manna? Are you kidding? Again? Manna again? Then we're described as fault finders who go after their own desires. Now, fault finder is someone like Absalom. You familiar with Absalom and David? David has a son named Absalom. And David's older. Absalom is sitting in the gates and saying, well, if I were king, let me tell you what I would do. My father does it. My father does it. But if I were king, fault finding, okay? Moses had his bouts with fault finders. Jude is saying that throughout Judea, we have a lot of fault finders. This is godless behavior. And their fault finding is based upon their own desires. It's based upon what they want, what their agenda is. Is it for the best for the country? Is it best for the hoi polloi, the many? Or is it for personal desires? Fault finding. And finally, they speak pompous things by admiring faces. You know what that is? That's a suck-up. This is someone that comes alongside and says great things to you with an agenda. I remember when I was a prof, a person would sometimes stop by and it wasn't often, but it was enough. Dr. Bateman, I am so looking forward to taking your class. I've read many of your books and I want to learn all I can from you. I've been given a scholarship and want to do well in all your class so I can go on and get a doctorate and write books. And then they don't get the grade they think they deserve. And you know what they turn into? Fault finders. But he's patronizing me. He's sucking up. He's proud. And you know, after a while you realize when they start making that distance from you and you're like, oh, all right, I knew what that was all about. No, not everybody was like that, but when the grade wasn't coming along that they want, then all of a sudden you're a scum of the earth. So much for how great they wanted to study. Anyway, I'm not the easiest prof either, so talk with Aaron and talk with Billy and they'll tell you all about it.
Does that guy ever get counseling? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, that's right. But anyway, so what Jude is saying that godless people are excessive gripers. This is what excessive griping, fault finding with others based upon a personal agreement or bias or some type of conviction. Ever run into somebody who's got a conviction and think you need to have that same conviction? All right, okay, moving right along. Patronizing people with flattering words to complete a personal agenda. This is godlessness. And Jude says, churches out there, Judean believers, you need to realize we're living in a godless society. This is godless behavior. We don't want that in our churches. We don't want to be joining this movement because of this godlessness. We move into some conclusions. It's not just addressing his concerns. It's not just identifying what the charges are. It's the conclusions that Jude draws here that is extremely important. They are damned. Whoa! They're damned. Some of our English translations say, "Woe to them." That just doesn't communicate. That's a old English way of referring to something bad is going to happen to you. And it's a term that oftentimes appears in the prophets. Hosea announces, "Woe to them, for they have strayed from me. Destruction to them, for they have rebelled." Just because of destruction, just say, they are damned, because these are two parallel structures. They are damned. They're going to be destroyed. They're going to be punished. Same in Isaiah. The look on their faces bears witness against them. They proclaim their sin. They're being like Sodom. He's writing to Jews in his time, and they're being compared to Sodom. They do not hide it. Woe to them, for they have brought evil upon themselves, or they are damned because they brought evil to themselves. Jude is saying that these godless people, they're condemned, they're damned. And look at the reasons why. He gives us 3 reasons. Because they followed Cain's path, because of greed, they poured themselves out in the error of Balaam, and because they were perished in the rebellion of Korah. Now, these threefold reasons aren't the easiest to explain, but I will give it a go. Okay, you ready? Hold on. We know of Cain, right? Genesis 4. He wants to offer a sacrifice. His brother offers a sacrifice. It's not accepted, eh? And Cain kind of gets angry about it, right? God says, get a handle on your anger. Get a grip. Cain doesn't get a grip. And what does he do? He murders his brother. And he suffers a threefold punishment. He's no longer able to cultivate the ground. That was one of his punishments. He's driven from God's presence. And he became a marked man. Now later on in Jewish history and Jewish literature, Cain is described as a person who his descendants became worse than he was. And they lived a debauched life, hating people, killing people, stealing from people. Many refer to Cain as being the prototype of sinners. So the first reason is that these godless people live like Cain. They raise Cain. The next is Balaam. Now, Balaam's a little more difficult to describe, because when I look at Balaam and I go back to Numbers and I read about Balaam, he's hired by King Balak to condemn the Israelites, right? And when you look at the Old Testament, he never condemns them. In fact, he praises them. He gives oracles of blessing. He does not fulfill what he was hired for. In fact, 2 of his oracles predict the coming of Jesus. Wow! Here he has been hired to curse the Israelites, and instead blesses them and makes an oracle about the coming of Messiah. So what in the world did he do? Well, there's just one little verse where before he goes home, Balak, that king who hired him, wants something for all that money he paid him. And so this is what Balak does. He says, Balak, this is what you do. Find the most beautiful women in your country. And send them to Gilead. And calls them and entice them. And cause them to marry your beautiful women. And then in the process, win them over to your gods. Lead them into idolatry. So this becomes foolish advice that ended up in godless behavior. Foolish advice that ends in godless behavior. That's the sin of Balaam. Finally, the last one is a little easier. It's Korah. They destroy themselves in Korah's rebellion. You know Korah. He's one of the priests that are part of the Exodus generation. And Moses and Aaron they're running things, and Aaron is chief priest. But you have tribes of priests within the Levitical tribe, and Korah is one of these subunits of the Levites. And he's not happy being second fiddle. He wants to be first fiddle. He wants the first chair in the orchestra. And he entices people to join in his rebellion. And what happens? Moses says, okay, I'm not going to decide this. Tell you what, we're going to let God decide this. So all you guys, Korah and you followers who want to replace me, you stand over there, and we'll stand over here, and we'll let God decide. Ground opens up, there goes Korah and his buddies, and consumed by fire. They're destroyed. That's how they're described. This is why he says these godless people are condemned. Religious leaders are not happy with their station in the rebellion. They're being destroyed in Korah's rebellion. The next one, so let me just summarize this. Godless people are damned for 3 reasons. Unchecked anger that hurts others. Foolish advice that leads to ungodly behavior. And rebellion against God and or his leaders. This is godless behavior that is condemned. The next, second conclusion he draws comes from 1 Enoch. I read a little bit from that yesterday. And we read in Scripture that, or in Jude, now Enoch, the 7th in descent, beginning with Adam, even prophesied about them. Prophesied about godless people. Not necessarily the godless people of Jude's day, but just talked about godless people through all ages. Whether it's before the flood, after the flood, before the nation of Israel was chosen, during the nation of Israel and its chosen. he talks about godless people transcend time, transcends races, transcends nations, transcends people groups, transcends gender. And so Enoch is prophesying about godless people. And he says, this is what he says, "Look, the Lord is coming with his holy myriad of angels." And even though Enoch is considered as being living prior to the flood, the Jewish people looked at Enoch as being very special because if you remember correctly, he walked with God for 300 years. And then he was gone. He was a godly man living in a very godless society. Just before the flood. And he's looking around saying, "Yo, guys!" There's my Philadelphia.
Yo, Adrian! Yo, men, women, you keep going in this direction, you're in trouble.
And the flood came. And they're looking at Enoch and perceiving him making these type of prophecies about godless people in light of the age in which he lived in. And Jude is saying, look around, Judean believers. We are living in a godless society. Watch it. He moves on, and he gives a twofold intention for this coming of Jesus. You see it? In order to execute judgment against all. Now you notice, against all means everyone. This is not just of godless people. Remember we already talked about in 5 through 7, God judges godlessness impartially. Whether you're chosen, an angel, or a Gentile, whether you're a believer or a non-believer. Sometimes we forget. We may be saved, but if we don't get a grip on our rebellion, and we don't confess it and make it right before God, when Jesus comes, you're going to be judged for your godless behavior. We won't be convicted and condemned because of Jesus, but we're still going to have to give an account for what we do. It's not just about our good works and how we serve within the church and community. It's even the way in which we behave. It's how we behave. You don't read about that in Paul. This is probably one of the reasons why nobody preaches Jude. I don't want to hear that. I'm a follower of Jesus. But we have that propensity because of the terrible two in each one of us to rebel. The other intention is to convict every godless person concerning the works of their ungodliness, which they committed, and concerning, look what else, the harsh things they say, slanderers. Not just your rebellion act, your acts of rebellion, but even the very things that you say, you'll be judged. So when Jesus returns, he intends to issue impartial judgments on all people concerning ungodly behavior in both word and deed. And he's going to convict the godless. And that conviction is not with an intent to repent. It's a conviction to eternal separation from God. So, how can we as a church preserve godliness in a godless society? Would you agree that we live today in a godless society? Anyone? Anyone not agree with that? We live in a godless society. We obviously are people in our godless and pluralist society poke the bear. They poke the bear. When we slander or speak inappropriately of God, of angels, and other people, we poke the bear.
When we rebel, whether it's against God's kingdom, God's leaders, or our societal norms, we both bear. When we complain or whine excessively, we both bear. When we seek to find fault with another person based upon personal disagreement, bias, or convictions, we both bear. When we patronize people with flattering words to fulfill a personal agenda, we both bear. This is godless behavior. Jude realized that the slander of people, angels or God, unchecked anger that hurts others, foolish advice that leads to ungodly behavior, rebellion against God and or his leaders, is not only condemned, it contaminates. It contaminates our worship in the church, and it negates the church's effectiveness in our godless society. How do we preserve godliness in a godless society? It is by not entertaining it within our communities. I'd like to encourage all of us, as we move into my last slide, to come clean. I've already shared with you, we all have this propensity to rebel against God. We have this terrible too. And I remember in Genesis 3, we read about Adam and Eve, and we read how they took the tree in the middle of the garden that they weren't supposed to. And you know how the story goes. God comes wandering in the garden and says, "Hey, Adam, Eve, where are you? Where'd you go?" And they're hiding, right? And finally, Adam and Eve come out and say, "Well, we were afraid for it." And God asked them, "Why are you hiding?" "Well, we were afraid because we were naked." "Who told you you were naked? Did you eat from that tree?" Do you remember the response? Adam. "Well, God, that woman you gave me, she made me do it." So he's blaming both God and Eve. And then Eve, what's the issue? "Well, you know that serpent, right? What does God really want?" He wants them to what? Come clean. Come clean. I like to, as we go into this closing song, to reflect on, it's a song by Chris Tomlin. It's called "Raise the White Flag." I surrender. You're my King. You're my God. I want to put aside my rebellion. I want to confess my rebellion. I want to be right with you because of what you've done on the cross for me. Now to the one who is able to keep each one of us faultless and to make us stand blameless in joy in his presence of his honor. To the only God, our deliverer, through Jesus, who is our Messiah. To the Lord, be honor, be majesty, be sovereignty, and dominion before all the ages, now and till all ages. Amen.